Now, I do want to introduce you because Ray Kearney, PhD, OAM, he's been awarded the Order of Australia in 2007, and he has been the head of the Department of Infectious Diseases and Immunology at Sydney University. It's a great pleasure to have you here today, Ray, and talking about a very important and actually surprising connection. So, Dr. Ray Kearney.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ron, for the opportunity to contribute to this forum. I'm going to begin with an analogy. In the Sydney region of Lane Cove, there is a bushland which is the habitat for mushrooms in a particular family. It's of international significance. These mushrooms have a unique association with mosses. The mushrooms are in fact parasites. In season, the fruiting structures attract fungi gnats, and the fungi gnats then lay eggs. From the eggs, larvae arise, and then you get pupation and more fungi gnats. Nearby are several different species of ground orchids. They cannot self-pollinate, they depend upon the fungi gnat. So they attract the fungi gnat by releasing a pheromone to mimic the fungus. And so the fungi gnats come in, they get thrown up inside, locked in, and the only way out is past the pollinia. And they pick up the pollinia, and of course they've achieved what the orchid wants. This is a cause and effect flow-on. We are very concerned about the overuse of anti-moss around swimming pools, getting into the creek. If it kills off the moss, there is a flow-on effect. Knocks out the fungus is not there for the gnat, and the gnat is not there for the orchid. But it's multifactorial. There are many factors operating. These fungi do not tolerate fertilizer. Petroleum products, particularly diesel, are now causing morphogenic effects on these fungi, causing the gills to come out of the top, like the liniment. The analogy is melatonin is one of our most profound hormones. It can be suppressed not only by fluoride, but by a number of other agents. That's the topic I'm going to discuss. In the middle of the brain, there is a pea-sized gland called the pineal gland. The pineal gland is under the influence of circadian rhythm, the external cues of light and darkness. Darkness, it is switched on. Bright light, it's switched off. But it is an important source of melatonin. It's not the only source. Throughout the body, virtually all tissues synthesize melatonin, but it is all contained within the cells. It is not secreted. And nor are those tissues under influence of light and darkness. Let's look at the distribution of melatonin over the years. The first thing I want to draw to your attention are the units. Picograms per mil. A picogram is a trillionth of a mil. These are exquisitely low levels. And so, things that suppress melatonin can have a profound influence. Highest levels occur before puberty, and indeed, the levels of melatonin influence the onset of puberty, and then it declines. 24-hour circadian rhythm of melatonin, in an ideal situation, of course, human beings, because of their creativity, can extend daylight at night. Let's assume the sun goes down. When it goes down, melatonin switches on. When melatonin rises in the early hours of the morning, cortisol, anti-inflammatory hormone, is switched off. Cortisol blocks implantation of the fertilized ovum by interfering with platelet activating factor. So it's natural to have a switch off of cortisol to have implantation. Melatonin does that. Some of the biological properties of melatonin. First of all, it is the most potent free radical scavenger. It neutralizes, it quenches free radicals which are potentially damaging. Prevents DNA damage by free radicals. It protects against cancer initiation and is itself anti-cancer. It binds calmodulin and blocks the activation of the estrogen receptor alpha. As we mentioned, it downregulates corticosteroid receptors. Looking into the mitochondrion, which is the source or the site in the cell that extracts energy from food, such as glucose, and converts it to ATP for use elsewhere. Here we have, in the situation, in that process, you've got these high energy molecules referred to as free radicals, let's call them sparks. And these are flying out, and unless they're quenched, they do damage. And indeed, some of the complex molecules that are produced, like cardiolipin linked to the hydroxyl radical, can lead to the stripping off of cytochrome C. Free cytochrome C can then work its way out into this system, the caspase system, and lead to cell death. So free radicals need to be quenched. Melatonin is your most important free radical scavenger. Without it, your cells are at risk of dying. Melatonin activates bone marrow cells. It activates natural killer cells, which are effective against virus infections. It also augments the antibody response. The classical antibody response involving those antibodies like IgG, IgM, IgA, to virus infections, bacterial infections, and so on. And it suppresses the response to allergy, asthma, for example. Low levels of melatonin tends to predispose to the induction of allergic responses. And there are other properties as well. We mentioned that inhibition of melatonin production results in severe suppression of the immune responses, including the production of antibodies. That can be reversed by supplementing with melatonin. Patients with autoimmune disease must not supplement with melatonin. The reason is that the autoantibodies will raise in their levels and exacerbate the condition. Melatonin inhibits the low-density lipoprotein receptor activity and the synthesis of cholesterol, so it has a health benefit. Decreases blood pressure, heart rate, etc., again, a health benefit. So if you're going to suppress melatonin, you're likely to put well-being and good health at disadvantage. Melatonin recently was found to be anti-obesity. Complex process, we haven't time to go into it, but just simply note the fact that when you suppress melatonin, you predispose the body toward putting on weight, obesity. Melatonin is your most potent anti-cancer hormone. Human tumours, cancers which have been studied to date include some of those that are listed. The effect is bell-shaped. High doses are not necessarily better than lower doses. There's a bell shape. There's an optimum. The optimum tends to be maximum physiological levels. And you can demonstrate that experimentally in mice. Low levels given to mice in their water, for example, you get greater anti-tumour effects than larger doses. Now, when a tumour multiplies, whatever the cause, it will reach about the size of a millimetre, and from there on it demands a blood supply. Many solid tumours go through a period of dormancy. Dormancy is not sleepiness. To illustrate what I mean, here is a process where, let's assume, dimethylbenzanthracene in diesel, and diesel is now classified as a level 1 human carcinogen. It will bring about initiation to the tumour cell. Multiplication, about a millimetre in diameter, million cells, demands a blood supply. And then, many of these tumours undergo apoptosis. And you get dormancy. Dormancy is not sleepiness. Dormancy is where death is balanced by multiplication. The most potent accelerator of tumour growth is inflammation. Inflammation, by definition, is the response of the body to tissue injury, involving cellular and humoral factors. Inflammation, along with some of these other promoters, will shift that balance, switch off apoptosis, and you get cell multiplication. Easily illustrated here. Experimental animals subjected to injections of tumours, same dose. On the left-hand side, only 6 of those tumours develop. But if you induce inflammation, you get 100% take and the tumours accelerate. Melatonin offsets that. So if you're exposed to a situation where certain environmental chemicals are going to switch off melatonin, this process puts you at risk. It's well documented that men with prostate cancer have low levels of melatonin. Melatonin confers protection against carcinogenic effects of environmental toxins, confers protection against potential carcinogenic hormones. For one example, breast cancer growth in human beings is accelerated by dietary linoleic acid. Linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid. It's an omega-6 fatty acid, and it will accelerate breast cancer. Melatonin interacts with breast cancer cells to downregulate the effect of linoleic acid. It blocks the fatty acid transport and stimulates apoptosis. Melatonin at night slows breast cancer growth by 70%. So if you're exposed to a factor which suppresses melatonin, cancer will not be slowed down. Longitudinal human studies of low-night melatonin in breast cancer, there's increasingly strong long-term evidence that low melatonin production is a risk factor for at least postmenopausal breast cancer. Most of us are familiar with the wonderful work of Jennifer Luke, who showed initially in the 1970s that fluoride accumulated in the pineal gland and virtually switched the gland off, including melatonin. The NRC has stated that fluoride is likely to cause decreased melatonin production to have other effects on normal pineal function, which in turn could contribute to a variety of effects in humans. And the work that Paul has been referring to, high levels of sodium fluoride accumulate in the pineal gland and cause its calcification and inhibits melatonin. We've seen these graphs earlier, and they create somewhat of an anomaly, where the DMFT values are decreasing very similarly in both fluoridated and non-fluoridated countries. So there are many factors operating to reduce caries, including diet. Seen this graph before, and again, see the column on the right-hand side, countries which are unfluoridated, there's a decrease in DMFT values. Fluoride is not the only product. Most medications prescribed to lower blood pressure may reduce serum melatonin. For example, certain beta blockers will completely switch off melatonin and create sleep dysfunctional problems. An estimated 40% of individuals who take beta blockers have sleep disorders. This is just a very quick diagram here. The green is the pineal site. You have this very circuitous process of a neurological signal going all the way around, and it activates the pineal site via these receptors, the beta-adrenergic receptor and the alpha-adrenergic receptor. Tryptophan is the starting material. It's an amino acid. It's converted to serotonin. Serotonin is the precursor for melatonin. You switch off tryptophan, as Roundup does, then you interfere with melatonin production. Propranolol, one of the beta blockers, you can see it has completely switched off melatonin production. Interestingly, marijuana is the most potent accelerator, inducer of melatonin. Over 200-fold, not to worry. Does fluoride lower IQ? We've heard the excellent presentations by Paul and Bill this morning, and there are two conflicting studies. The one in Dunedin last year said there was no significant difference. And I think the information presented by Bill is so compelling that I can't wait for the results to be published to show that fluoride in fact does impact upon IQ. Duty of care. According to the USA EPA, fluoride is a chemical with substantial evidence of developmental neurotoxicity. So beware, adopt the precautionary principle. Why subject our children to this ongoing fluoridation experiment to satisfy the political agenda of special interest groups, even if fluoridation reduces cavities, is brain health more important than tooth health? Periodontitis is an inflammatory disease involving tissues of the gum margin. There are different classifications of periodontal disease. But what struck me was what we don't hear, a very strong association of periodontal disease in high fluoride water. Yes, we hear about the anticaries, but we don't hear about the fact that there's a strong association of periodontal disease with high fluoride water. And the authors have pointed out there's been no effort, appears to have been reported in the literature, to account for the increased periodontal disease in high fluoride areas. Why? We need to be aware of illogical correlations. More and more people drink milk, more and more people get cancer, therefore milk causes cancer. Coronary heart disease is more common in wealthier countries than in poorer. Therefore wealth causes heart disease. Illogical correlations. We need to be aware of that. So we need to look further into this periodontitis and fluoride. Studies have shown that patients with periodontal disease have lower, significantly lower levels of melatonin. Is that an effect of high doses of fluoride suppressing melatonin? It's confirmed in another study. Periodontitis sufferers have a significantly lower melatonin level than healthier subjects. So the association becomes stronger. The inflammatory condition can be moderated by, by melatonin. Indeed, I understand melatonin is now given as a treatment for periodontitis. But also, secretory IgA antibody is important in binding to antigens and to the infectious organisms, involved in the periodontitis. Low levels of IgA are associated with low levels of melatonin. I'm not talking about genetic immune deficiency states. So the question is, what are the levels of secretory IgA like in patients with periodontitis? There's one study, the average value of IgA in saliva for periodontitis patients is significantly lower than in control group. Moving on very quickly and concluding. Melatonin has a very important role to play in the immune system. Roundup blocks melatonin by interfering with tryptophan. EMR can block melatonin if you're living close to certain towers. Sulfate is important in certain neurological diseases. Melatonin transports that sulfate into the brain. Here, heparan sulfate, that's not heparin sulfate, heparan sulfate is associated with, or low levels of heparan sulfate associated with autism. The sulfate is transferred with melatonin into the third ventricle. The sulfate's passed on to the heparin. You don't have melatonin, you don't get the sulfate. You don't get the sulfate, there's a risk of autism. Finishing off, we've heard that, we've read that before. Come back to the analogy. Fluoride, alone or in combination with other factors, can be a serious effect on health and well-being. Is medicine a science? Medicine is largely based on the sciences. It has not yet become a science. Medicine is replete with discarded therapies. There have been unnecessary delays in implementing measures. We've always heard in the past, stress causes ulcers. I mentioned earlier today, Semmelweis was sacked because he made an observation that dirty hands led to infections. In the 1940s, the medical profession actually advocated smoking Camel cigarettes. At a time also when tonsillectomies, adenoidectomies were common as part of mainstream medicine. Stephen Hawking, the greatest threat to knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. Those who know not and know not that they know not are fools. The illusion of knowledge, many prominent leaders of the pro-water fluoridation movement have recently admitted publicly that they were wrong. And this is consistent with some of the laws. Finally, the law is clear. Where there is a foreseeable and preventable risk of harm to your neighbour, the owner has a duty of care to remove that risk. And I rest my case. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. I like your talk. The fluoride that accumulates in the pineal gland and the decrease in melatonin, how many studies is that based on? Has it been repeated? Also, what's the mechanism whereby fluoride decreases melatonin production from the pineal gland?
As I understand, the mechanism is one of calcification of the actual pineal gland. As I understand, and Paul may be able to add more to this, that the mechanism is one of calcification of the pineal gland, rendering the pineal gland unable to switch on and produce melatonin.
And was that study repeated?
Yes. Yes.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Okay.
With melatonin and fluoride, does the alum that they use in the water treatment, which is used for flocculation of the stuff in the water, this aluminium assists the fluoride to cross into the blood barrier of the brain. Is this actually working with the pineal gland as well? Does that also interfere with it?
Look, we haven't got involved with the aluminium side to this, but there's no question that aluminium seems to have a synergistic effect with fluoride, and that's as much as I can comment on it.
Did you make?
Ray, we've got to know about the fluoride accumulation in skeletal, like bone tissue, and you mentioned uptake by pineal tissue gland. Is it known that with other soft tissue types, whether some tissues are more susceptible? Some tissue types?
Tissue types more susceptible
or
to
organs,
fluoride.
Similar to the pineal gland. Has there been comparisons done with other tissues or organs?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, melatonin is produced in virtually all tissues, but it's contained. It is not secreted into the bloodstream. In fact, 400 times more melatonin is produced in the gut. But Monsanto's Roundup blocks tryptophan, and you get a dramatic reduction in the capacity of those cells to produce melatonin within the cells. I can't comment on all the tissues other than melatonin is produced in organs and in the pineal gland. The pineal gland is most susceptible to the effects of fluoride.
Here.
My question is back to relates to the pineal gland. Once the pineal gland's calcified, is there any way that calcification can be reversed and therefore the function of the gland can be restored?
As a pharmacist, you're obviously very interested. I'm not aware that you can reverse that calcification. If anyone in the audience can say otherwise, please say so. The comment from the member is that boron may play a role. I can't say yes or no. So once it's calcified, then it's hard to reverse it. Hydroxyapatite.
Sorry, just a quick one. Did you say before that although many other glands and parts of the body produce melatonin, that melatonin is effectively inactive and it's only the pineal gland melatonin that's active?
No, what I said was the pineal gland actually secretes the melatonin. Other glands, other tissues, other organs produce melatonin, but the melatonin is contained within the cells. It is not secreted. Does that answer your question? No, it does not release it to the body.
Are there any other questions, Charles? Oh, come on.
Does fluoride cross the blood-brain barrier?
Does fluoride cross the
blood-brain barrier?
Does fluoride cross the blood-brain barrier?
John, can you answer that? Or Paul?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
It crosses the placenta as well.
It crosses the placenta as well.
And I think personally,
outside the blood-brain barrier, so it's not protected.
I think the issue is at certain times of the life of an individual, the blood-brain barrier can be impaired. Stress, we found that with veterans, stress allowed things to cross the blood-brain barrier that they couldn't have. I think it's very fragile in the first few weeks of life, and it gets more vulnerable with old age. I think so the two issues. One, it can cross, but two, there are particular times when it can cross more easily.
And it is actually worth noting, and we need to remind ourselves here, that we are on a daily basis exposed to hundreds, thousands, 100,000 chemicals. of which only really 20%, we make an assumption that there's been told, look, if it's passed, it's on the shelves, it must have passed all the tests. Only 20% have had any serious toxicology done on them, and endocrine disrupting chemicals and phthalates, which I think are fairly pervasive in our society, also increase permeability of the blood-brain barrier. So, you know, it's not just about fluoride, but, you know, we are talking about fluoride. Another question was there? Sorry.
Yes, indeed, it's an additive effect of all of these particular contributors to the levels of melatonin. If the person's on beta blocker, that's another factor.
I loved some of your quotes, especially the one from Stephen Hawking. Now what you've got on the board there, I'd just like to ask you, is that just a moral supposition, or is that a genuine statute?
That Stephen Hawking, he made that observation. He said the greatest threat to knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. And what I've done is taken, perhaps clarified that with one line out of that famous proverb, Persian proverb, they who know not and know not that they know not are fools. This morning we heard a comment about this was very evangelical. That is emotional, based on pride and prejudice. We need to have more logic, not the illusion of knowledge.
Thank you, Ray, and I think that's almost a great moment on which to end with. But gee, we've got time perhaps just for... I'll ask you.
Sorry, then is there a case for taking melatonin supplementation?
Is there a case for taking melatonin supplementation?
I mean, the 3 milligram, you can't buy it here in Australia, but you do get it in America.
Okay, let me just point out here. First of all, melatonin cannot be purchased in Australia without a medical prescription. I do not recommend the melatonin that is labelled 3 milligrams on the label in the health food store, and down the corner it's got by 6. That's 3 milligrams diluted 10 to the 6th, referred to as homeopathic melatonin. I won't have anything to do with it. 3 milligram, yes, but you can import it from America. They sell it like Mars bars over there, and you don't have a medical prescription, but you're allowed up to 3 months to import. Most pharmacists don't carry it, except compounding pharmacists. But you need a prescription to get melatonin here. And I would recommend that you don't get more than 3 milligrams per tablet. Real melatonin.
So if you happen to be in America and bring it back,
yes, that's fine.
3 milligram,
yes.
3 milligram capsule at night is going to do damage.
No. Remember, the sublingual one is better, because if you take the oral one, most of it just goes through the liver, is altered and out. The sublingual is better.
So could you increase the dose if you're not taking the sublingual one?
Look, you've got to do your own trial and error here. Don't take melatonin during the day, obviously. Again, people who exercise at night do better in that they have less destruction on their tissue than those who exercise during the day, because melatonin is not about during the day to quench those free radicals that you've generated. Nighttime is the best time to do strenuous exercise to minimise free radical damage. You've got to be careful you don't get too tired. If you take doses too high, you feel very drowsy in the